If there's any questions throughout the presentation, please pop them in the chat, and just to keep you all awake, I'm going to pop a few polls in there as well. So please do answer the questions if you can. Okay, so in the words of Chris Whitty, next slide, please. So just a little bit about who are Stepchange. So we're one of the biggest free organisations to provide holistic debt advice, and we've been doing this for just over 27 years. On average, one person contacts us every 48 seconds, and we work with a staggering 900 partner organisations who refer their customers, their employees, or potentially their clients to the charity because they've identified that they have got problems with their money. And a large proportion of these people that we help are vulnerable. Next slide, please. So, like everybody, it's been an interesting 12 months, to say the least. We've had a really interesting year in terms of the amount of people that have sought help via our website. You can see there over 6 million people, or 6 million visits to the website, and really being a source of information at the very earliest stage of the pandemic. I think we had 500,000 hits right at the end of March, and people sort of searching everything from what is furlough, looking at self-employed calculators, understanding the impact of redundancy, and looking at what options are. And we've continued to update and reflect the societal changes on that website. We manage solutions for consumers to their creditors, and we paid just under £400 million worth of debt back to creditors last year. So that's a little bit about what we saw last year. On to the next slide. It's been quite an emerging picture, really. So ordinarily, Stepchange would help people who were really in a debt crisis, that potentially that crisis has built up over a number of months, and in some cases years. But actually, we're seeing people come to us who this time last year, or even 13 months ago, could never imagine that they would need help from a debt charity. You can see there that women continue to be overrepresented in our client population. Combination of factors, lower paid roles, tend to have the burden of childcare and so on. And you can see there an emerging picture there around the increase in council tax arrears. So we know there's been a lot of forbearance in financial services over the last 12 months, things like payment holidays. But obviously council tax is one of those where that FCA forbearance hasn't been on a similar footing. I like to bring some direct quotes from some of the people that we help, and you can see there, you know, parents going without food to make sure that their kids eat, and we all know about the prevalence and the increase of food banks. So next slide, just some additional stats there. One of the things that I'd really like to sort of highlight really is that there's a new cohort of people who are coming for debt advice as a result of the pandemic, and they're probably people like lots of people on this call, professional people, career people, everything from airline pilots to restaurateurs, suddenly finding themselves having to apply for universal credit, and then really understanding how much universal credit actually is, and really being at a loss to even put food on the table. Okay. Thanks. Next slide, please. And whilst I am going to get on to the main part of my presentation, I think it's really worth understanding the mindset of people, not everybody who's in debt, but the majority of people who come with a huge amount of negative emotion when relating to debt. If anybody else on this call who's found themselves in debt or arrears, you may relate to some of these, or potentially friends and family have been in this situation. A huge amount of guilt. They feel ashamed, overwhelmed. They are fearful. They're going to lose their home. people are going to be made aware, and that does in turn lead to mental health issues. So as we go through what I'm trying to explore in the next few slides is if you can remember that mindset, because as we develop more and more digital collections tools, you know, helping people in that mindset, we need to be really cognizant of that. Next slide, please. So, quick poll. I'm trying to understand my audience here. I'm in a room in Leeds in a tower block, and obviously I can't see anybody. So if you could just nip onto the polls, it'd be really good to understand what organisation, what sector you're in. So are you in financial services, either a lender, DCA or other, utility, local authority or other? It'd just be really helpful for me to understand that. Okay, other, okay. Oh, I didn't design that poll very well, did I there? So I obviously don't know my audience, so I'll need to work on my my extrasensory perception. Next slide, please. Okay, so really wanting to understand where your organisations are in terms of digital collections. What I mean by digital collections is not just the ability to make a payment, but actually to explore repayment options, complete income and expenditure where required, and actually agree a repayment rate or a repayment plan. So yeah, if you could just vote there, that would be great. Okay, just wait for a few more votes to come in. Complete spread at the moment. Oh, there we go, just inching into thinking about it. Okay, so that's really helpful to understand that it's not everybody's completely on that journey. Okay, lovely. Next slide, please. Okay, so digital collections and vulnerable customers. So how are we going to design journeys that reflect the scale of potential vulnerable consumers, and what are the things that need to be in place to ensure that from a regulatory perspective meet all the requirements, but also for a great consumer experience with a long-term outcome that actually consumers are able to stick to that agreed plan. Okay, next slide. So, slides are a bit blurry. I don't know whether that's just me at the moment. I can't actually read that, but luckily I can try and remember it from memory. So I think it's always worth, when you're thinking about vulnerable consumers, to remind ourselves about the FCA position for those in the Financial Conduct Authority's regulatory environment. One point there really is the scale of vulnerability. So 53% of adults in their latest pandemic survey highlight that they could have an element of vulnerability. So when we're thinking about designing effective digital collections journeys, it's actually designing for the majority, 50-50, but actually designing really compelling, simple journeys. You will actually meet your own regulatory requirements if you're focused on vulnerable consumers and designing that from the get-go. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm really having to remember my slides from memory because I'm having quite a challenge here. So in case anybody isn't aware of them, the FCA highlight 4 key drivers when it comes to vulnerability. So health, so affect the ability to interact, or just general illnesses that cause issues in day-to-day life. Life events, I think global pandemic would probably need to be added into that group there. Resilience, so we've seen a huge impact on people's financial resilience. We know from our own research that 15 million people have had less than £100 in savings prior to the pandemic. So the ability to absorb financial shocks. And then capability, so the ability to actually deal with differing issues, access digital services. I mean, obviously we're talking about digital here, but some people clearly are digitally excluded. And when we're thinking about designing digital journeys, they obviously go hand in hand with existing journeys in a telephony environment. So next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to have to press pause here because I can't actually read this slide. So I'm hoping the tech guys can, thank you so much. There we go. Great, hopefully everybody's still with me. Okay, so these are the areas that I want to explore in terms of designing and having journeys that work for vulnerable consumers. So starting with getting the basics right from an accessibility perspective, leveraging expert organisations, a big focus on disclosure, opportunities to get additional support, ensure understanding is captured throughout the journey, signpost out to organisations, and as with all customer journeys and processes, keep refining that journey based on analytics, but also most importantly, consumer feedback. Okay, so next slide. Okay. I think there's a build on this, so thank you. So in terms of getting the basics right, the absolute sort of mantra here, and I did seek some expert advice, and I will, throughout the session, highlight resources that I think are useful. There's one of the leading lights from a vulnerability perspective is a gentleman called Chris Fitch, who is part of the Bristol University Personal Finance Unit, but also works very closely with the Money Advice Trust and UK Finance on the Vulnerability Academy. And ahead of this session, I sort of said, you know, what are the top 3 things really that he would advocate? And I think number 1 is getting the basic rights. So ensuring that your digital journeys meet the accessibility standards, making your site fully accessible and working for all of those vulnerabilities has to be the starting point. And in designing simple journeys that meet the needs of the majority. So I said there, so 53% of consumers would be classed as having some sort of vulnerability. It's not about bolt-ons. It's not about creating a couple of pages that you know, signpost out. It's about designing journeys and collections processes, bearing in mind that mindset of shame, of guilt, of isolation and anxiety that are going to work for that majority. And coming from a debt charity, but also with my background, is to focus on the consumer, the customer, and not the debt outcome that organisations would ordinarily absolutely focus on. So that's getting the basics right. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've put here work with experts, and obviously as organisations you're working with Esendex because they are experts in their field. But here, when it comes to vulnerability, is to work with experts to test out your thinking, your journey, and those that are expert in vulnerability. So charities, organisations like Stepchange, the Money Advice Trust, but organisations who specialise in something called lived experience. And by lived experience, we mean vulnerable consumers. So these could be people with complex mental health issues, complex physical issues, learning difficulties. And there are organisations out there who absolutely specialise in this. Ourselves as Stepchange, we're working with one of the major banks to ongoing review their new digital repayment plan setup, and using our expertise and to help them, and that's all gratis, by the way. And also your customers and your staff with lived experience. You'd be surprised how many staff in organisations actually, they could be everything from having mental health issues, they could be carers, they could have family members with English as a second language, a huge amount of resource there to tap into. What I've put on the next build actually is some of the resources that may be of use, and these slides are obviously going to be available. If you just do the build for me there, Demi, that'd be great. So an organisation called Fair by Design, the Money Advice Trust, I have to say, are a leading light when it comes to designing and understanding the needs of vulnerable consumers. Highly recommend that organisation. And then a couple of experts in their field who work very much in the realm of customer experience from a vulnerability perspective, and also Helen there, who does a lot in this space from a coaching and training perspective. So work with experts in the same way that you'd work with experts to maximise telephony platforms, collections rates. Work with vulnerable experts to help really design great journeys that are going to result in the outcomes that you're looking for, and work with consumers. Next slide, please. So this next piece really is something that I think is fast emerging as one of the areas that's going to need the most focus. So if you think over the last 10, 15 years, the prevalence of models and best practice when it comes to encouraging consumers to open up and share their personal situation in the collections journey, that's predominantly been done in a telephony environment. And there are a number of models that can be utilised to build good rapport, listening skills, asking the right questions to get that consumer to open up. And that is obviously something in a digital environment is going to be challenging to replicate. So what I'd like to really focus now is understand from a disclosure perspective, what do we mean? So how do you understand the decision to disclose, the types of disclosure, and the environment to encourage disclosure? And then I'll go on to a couple of examples where I think organisations are definitely getting there in terms of building a good disclosure environment. So can you go back? Sorry. Thank you. So in terms of the decision to disclose, so I guess the question to you all, if you were asked in an online journey, would you share some personal sensitive information? We'd all have our own bias to whether we would or we wouldn't. And what are what surrounds that decision to disclose? So what are the barriers to actually getting a consumer to share? Well, it could be their experience of previous organisations. They've told somebody something and the advisor or the digital journey has just ignored it. It could be not understanding what the benefits to disclosure could be. Why would I possibly tell my credit card company or my utility provider that I've got a life event or an issue? What are they going to do for it? So there are some considerations around decisions to disclose, and not everybody is going to disclose. So in terms of the types of disclosure, it's about creating really positive signals, and this comes onto the environment to encourage disclosure. So the types of disclosure, it could be very, very high level. It could be incredibly detailed. And in a digital journey, how do you create the environment to be able to do that? So for example, if somebody sort of was asked this question on the telephone, how much are they likely to disclose? What's the opportunity for open questions? That can elicit in somebody's life story coming out. It could be just, very click, one word answers in a telephony environment. So how do we get that disclosure to work online? And there's going to be an art form to developing that in a really compelling way. And then it's about the environment. So how if consumers have a reticence or there are barriers to disclosure, what does that environment look like to get people to open up? And I think there's a really sort of a good starting point there is, for the product or service we're providing, is there any additional help or support you need? Some people might go, oh, well, yeah, maybe, and you then start that dialogue. It's a really good resource there from the Money Advice Trust that I've included, so do to take a look at that. So on the next slide, I'm just going to ask those that do have a full digital collections journey, have you got disclosure? and whereabouts have you put that in your journey? So I think we've got a sample size of one who've actually got a journey live, but perhaps those who are in development, where have you put this? Where are you thinking of putting it? So if we nip over to the polls and vote accordingly. Is that coming up? Here we go. So, okay. So that's interesting. Within the first few steps, and then haven't got disclosure built in. So that's going to be potentially an interesting opportunity to think about within the first few steps. Okay. Okay, and on the next poll. Okay, so for those that have got disclosure, what sort of percentage are you getting of people actually, for 100 people completing a digital collections journey, what proportion are actually telling you something? So please vote now. Just wait for a few more votes to come in. Okay, well, we'll monitor that poll as we go on. Okay, so next slide. So in terms of encouraging that disclosure, so we saw that some have got it in the first few steps, some's got it around the middle, and others don't have that built in. So on these links here, I've just included some examples of organisations that have created an environment that is conducive to getting consumers to open up. So, Demi, are you able to click on those hyperlinks for me, please? Starting with Monzo. Okay. So share with us. I think this is just, I have to declare that I'm a bit of a super fan of Monzo. I've been a customer of theirs for about 3 years now, but it's actually just dealing with that barrier sort of face on around, well, why would I disclose? So it's saying, might sound surprising, but it can sometimes be helpful to tell your bank a bit more about yourself. And they highlight there the credentials of the organisations that they work with to demonstrate why it would be good to share and disclose. So that's one example from Monzo. If we flip back and go and have a look at what Lloyds are doing. Okay, so Lloyds have created a lot of content in terms of encouraging consumers that, you know, that the bank is aware that life events happen. So if we just scroll down there, Demi, you can start to highlight what all those different issues could be. So is illness affecting your money? What I really particularly love about these is about sharing the story, but also demonstrating the benefit of Charlie opening up about his situation and how the bank were able to help via a colleague in the branch. That's really important to send really strong signals about why, you know, it's not just sharing information for the sake of sharing information, but it's about how that information could be utilised. And I think in a collections environment, that can be really useful insight. It could be that they've got multiple debts, multiple issues, and actually would benefit from some specialist organisational advice. So, and if we then just flip onto Barclays finally, Barclays have created a really powerful set of, I think there's 13 sort of areas on this part of their Money Worries page, specifically about all different aspects. So living with less income, how to balance illness and debt and mental health, really highlighting that the bank understands that there are times when dealing with your money can be really, really challenging. And it's about opening up that dialogue to prevent debt in the first place, but also creating an environment that the consumer feels that they can open up and share. So really, really, I think some really good examples to demonstrate actually disclosing is of benefit to the consumer. Okay, thanks, Demi. Next slide, please. So as you sort of go through that collections journey and the consumer's shared information, it's really important throughout that journey, because somebody could be finding themselves in a debt situation for the first time, is creating an online journey that provides additional support. So it's really important that, you know, online journeys can be at times quite binary and quite linear, is to actually highlight different parts of that journey that may warrant additional support for vulnerable consumers. It could be reassuring statements, it could be additional links to explain why information wants to be in there. But it also could be, and lots of organisations are doing this now, but proactive chatbots, reactive advisor chats, but also offering to connect with somebody who's fully trained in ability to help them actually on the phone. There could come a point in a journey where actually the complexity of that person's vulnerabilities could warrant a preference for the phone. Some consumers would actively reject that. Their preference would be to stay in a digital environment, and that's where your chatbot with a fully trained vulnerability advisor, so not just somebody who can deal with sort of live chat in a sort of vanilla way and just dealing with the day-to-day, but actually somebody who is trained in a similar way that you would in a telephony environment. Next slide, please. Ensuring understanding throughout. So if you, and I'm sure many of you have call listened, you can tell those consumers who need extra support and are not giving real strong sort of statements or demonstrating confusion. And, you know, great advisors are able to take that pace a little bit slower, ask questions in a different way, and check for understanding. And it's really, really important that that is a feature within an online journey. So checking understanding, demonstrating how much of the process there is to do, providing additional content, so providing hovers, demonstrating why that information is needed, but also the ability to go back, also the ability to save information and come back if they are struggling. And utilising analytics across your site to understand where are the areas that people keep dropping out, which I'm sure organisations do very much from a collections perspective or from an engagement perspective, but from a vulnerable consumer perspective, which are the parts of the website that's just not the journey that is just not working. And again, if a customer is struggling and is on a particular part of the site, again, that proactive offer for a chat or a call can really help them complete that, reassure them. Back to that mindset, if somebody is, you know, in a highly anxious state, really struggling, got minimized capability, that offer of support and checking point will ensure they can get through the journey, complete the information accurately, and get into a repayment plan that it's going to work for them. Okay, next slide. I would say this at this point, but from a comp perspective, from an FCA perspective, anybody that's obviously got multiple arrears does need to be signed out to specialist support through free debt advice, but also providing links to expert organisations who can help them. So in an ideal world, that would be a bespoke link based on the vulnerability. In a previous life, I worked in an open banking startup, and we were developing that through the chatbot. So if somebody said that they had a mental health issue, we could design the proactive chatbot to signpost out to Mind. But really making sure that there's a guided explanation as to why you're passing this person onto a different organisation. Again, highly anxious state, they could be really worried that you can no longer help them, or it just could be that actually they'd be better suited to get help elsewhere. I particularly like this quote here from James, who's one of our clients. You know, getting advice is a bit like admitting you have a drink problem, takes courage. And I think, you know, in a digital environment, we need to be really cognizant that whilst we don't hear from that consumer, you know, that we do maintain that that consumer could be having a really difficult experience behind that screen. And finally, as with all customer journeys and processes, is keep refining. So understand how your journey is working through a complex set of analytics, but also direct insights through research from consumers with lived experience. Really, maintain those links with expert organisations and use that feedback to improve, and stay in touch with experts, latest thinking and podcasts. I put a link there to a conference that happened, I think late last week, which is all about vulnerable consumers in collections with a range of speakers, and it could be that you find that particularly useful. So I just want to end on one of our clients that we helped. I think it's, again, a lot of people think people who get into trouble with money could be, have just been quite wasteful or profligate, but actually what we see time and time again is it's a life event. So this is Carol's story, and I'll let her do the talking.
I don't know why they don't talk about it. People assume that it's because you live way beyond your means, but it doesn't take much for it to suddenly become beyond your means, but it wasn't when you started. I was a day rate contractor, earning a decent amount of money, so didn't really have any worries at all. A few credit cards and a bank loan, but nothing that I couldn't manage. My first worry when work started to dry up was keeping a roof over my head, paying the mortgage, feeding myself and looking after the dog. Credit cards for me have always been and are a luxury thing. They're not something you use to survive day to day, but that's what they became. I started to have to make choices. Do I eat this week? Do I pay the mortgage or do I pay the electricity? I kind of isolated myself, stayed in the house and sat in the living room, cried, forgot to open the door, didn't open the door, was terrified of opening mail. I turned to advice from a friend. That was when I was at my lowest point, and that's when she said to me that I should seek help, which is what I did. It is almost like it was yesterday. I don't think you ever forget. I was anxious and didn't know what to expect. But it's probably one of the best calls I've ever made in my life, to be honest. The lady that picked up the phone was very good. She was very patient. She didn't judge in any way whatsoever and reassured me that I wasn't beyond help and there was certainly something that they could do for me. After I spoke to the advisor, it was decided that the best approach was the debt management plan. Having the creditors dealt for me on my behalf, it took a huge weight off my shoulders. All the phone calls stopped and then eventually the letters stopped coming, so that made a huge difference, yes. One of the great things about being on a debt management plan is that it is flexible. I was advised that if my circumstances changed, you can just make adjustments to pay more or less depending on your circumstances, which I felt really, really useful. My advice would be to seek help as soon as you can, and I would certainly unhesitantly recommend Stepchange. Yeah. Quite frankly, without that help, I don't know where I'd have ended up. I might have lost everything. I genuinely don't know and don't want to think about where that could have led without the help. It was one of the best calls I ever made, and it did change my life for the better.
So yes, that was Carol, a contract day rate project manager, could be working in any of our organisations, and unfortunately her work dried up and she found herself needing the help of Stepchange. So thank you very much for listening. Hope that was useful. I can see we've got a couple of questions in the chat, so I will attempt to answer those. So for those without disclosure, what should the first steps be? I think first of all is understand how your journey is working. So where have you got various dropout rates? Where are you seeing consumers not engaging? I then sort of think about creating that environment for disclosure. So it's not a case of an identikit process where you go, right, put it in at stage 5. It needs to be about creating an environment for disclosure and finding where that would work best in your journey, and then building that right language, that right question, and then making sure that it's not just in isolation. So simply just asking the question. There has to be that benefit. There has to be that, okay, so if I do tell this person that I've got complex mental health issues, or I'm having treatment for cancer, what's in it for me? So I would look at your journey in totality, look at where the consumer dropout is, and then build a really good environment for disclosure. How does disclosure vary by channel? Which are the main barriers for disclosure by channel? So I think the biggest barrier to disclosure is experience of other organisations. So if the last organisation that you engaged with provided you with a really great experience, then obviously you're more likely to disclose to the next organisation, and conversely the opposite would be true. I think it's, in terms of our own online journey, so we're fully omni-channel in the way that we provide debt advice. We actually don't see online as a barrier to disclosure. And actually we see more vulnerable consumers completing the online journey than people who are not vulnerable. So I think it's about creating the right environment, create the right signals, and ensuring that people understand the benefits to that disclosure. As I say, you know, around 54% of people that come through on our online journey declare a vulnerability, which is in line with the FCA percentage of 53%. So if you do it well, it can work on both, but it's about understanding the experience that they've had of other organisations. So as more organisations get much better at this and highlight the benefits, we will get more and more people disclosing. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I'm not sure if I'm over time, under time, but thank you very much to Esendex. Oh, I've got one more. Does disclosure help to have a more affordable payment strategy? Do lenders show more empathy? Oh, that's a good question. I certainly think in a telephony environment, the greater the insight to that customer's situation, and really getting them to open up, demonstrate empathy, listening skills, and that advisor is able to agree a really proper, affordable arrangement. The art of the possible is going to be replicating that in a digital environment. I think I couldn't say with any assurance that really effective disclosure is going to lead to a more affordable payment strategy, unless there are elements in the journey that can reflect different blends of repayment plans. And I think I haven't seen yet anybody demonstrating that, but I'm happy to hear from any organisations that have done that, whereby there's a different journey if someone's disclosed and depending on the vulnerability. But yes, lenders showing more empathy is always a good thing. Okay, I think that's about it. Thank you so much. If anybody wants to ask any further questions, you can drop me a line on LinkedIn. And again, on all the slides can be circulated, and there's loads of resources in there if you're wanting to explore this issue. Thanks very much.